All right, y'all, it's story time. And we about to do chapter 3 of They Were Her Property. Y'all, this is your trigger warning. Just to remind you, this book is about the ownership of Black people by white women enslavers. So you will be triggered in several different ways. As I've mentioned on a previous video, for chapters 4 through 8, I will do a summary because this book is very hard to get through. And I cannot do chapter by chapter because of how hard this book is to read. Chapter 3 is entitled Mrs. Done Her Own Bossing. So this idea of white women not being involved in the enslavement of Black people is a huge misconception and a bold-faced lie. Because the independence of women were nurtured by their fathers, who were mostly the enslavers. And these fathers knew how laws in the South were catered towards white men. So they decided to make provisions for their daughters so that they can have wealth, so that they can have status and security and secure their own property rights and authority as slave owners. And it became a white woman enslaver's choice. She had a choice on whether or not she would pass that privilege of being able to dictate what happens to her slaves onto her husband. There were several reasons why some women chose not to do this, whether it was because of the way that men treated their slaves versus the way women treated their slaves, whether it was to have this identity of her own, but mainly to make sure that her wealth increased. And her wealth would increase when she refused to relinquish her rights to property to her husband. Now we remember in chapter 2, on paper, it seemed like women didn't have rights to anything once they were married. But we've learned throughout chapter 2 and now going into chapter 3 that wasn't necessarily true. By holding on to their property, whether it's in writing from their fathers, their mothers who passed down the tradition to their daughters, or something that they were able to obtain through writings from their previous marriage going into a new marriage, they were able to have their own identity and their own possession of their own slaves. Because women during colonial periods were not frail, they were not helpless, they were accomplices. Now, it was believed that some historians thought that white women enslavers could not be more effective enslavers the way that white male enslavers were because they were not as brutal. And during that time, they believed that beating your slaves or being completely violent or torturing your slaves was the best way to keep your slaves in order. And because they believed that women were more frail, white women were considered to be more frail in comparison to white men, it was believed that they lacked the capabilities of keeping their enslaved Africans in order. Now, it's interesting that they allow fragility for white women, but did not allow fragility for Black women enslavers. Like they're supposed to be tough. And we see that in some of the same narratives about Black women today. Like they are considered, and I should say in some cases, we are considered to be strong. We have to be this strong Black woman all the time. And when I was reading this chapter, I started to think about it. It's like, why is it that she is considered the white woman enslaver who is taking the freedom of someone and has the capability of beating them and torturing them or mentally treating them like children while holding on to their freedom? Why is she given the title of fragility, but the person she's inflicting harm on, the person whose freedom she's taking, doesn't have the ability to be considered fragile? And sometimes I think that we don't give Black women the capacity to be fragile. And as I'm reading through this chapter, I'm tying the two together, and it's really making me think how much of the way that we are viewed in this country is deeply rooted in colonial enslavement. So back to the book. The ultimate goal of the historian's evaluation was women were considered to treat their enslaved people as children versus men were treating their enslaved people as property who needed to be beaten and brutally tortured to keep them in line. And we're going to see this with the laws that were passed. The biggest example that I've seen so far was in South Carolina. So South Carolina had this law that said that enslavers were required to publicly beat their slaves as a form of discipline. And they had a system in the way that the punishment would increase. So for the first offense, 40 lashes. And if a woman enslaver would not do this, they would have to pay a constable to actually beat their slave in front of everybody. The second offense will probably be branding, where they would take a hot poker and put a symbol on the end of a poker, light it up, heat it up as much as possible, and then burn the flesh of the enslaved person. The third offense would be dismembering. Now, if you've seen Roots, a form of dismembering would be cutting off a foot for running away. Another offense could be eye gouging for learning to read, fingers being chopped off for learning to write, teeth being knocked out, all forms of dismemberment. A fourth offense could possibly be a family member being sold away, which inflicts a psychological trauma. And of course, the fifth and last offense would be death, where they would legally be allowed to murder you for committing a fifth offense as an enslaved person. And so it is because of these types of laws, they felt that women were incapable of being decent slave owners because they didn't lack the guts to do such a thing. I mean, it is cruel and unusual punishment for wanting to escape and wanting to have your freedom, for wanting to be seen as a human being and not property, but apparently no. These offenses were very, very horrible. So sometimes we need to consider that when something is against the law, it doesn't mean that the law is always right. The law can also be cruel. The law can also be inhumane. And a lot of laws have been passed in this country to dehumanize Black people and to take away their freedoms, utilizing these same laws. And for those of you who like to quote Dr. King so much, an unjust law is no law at all. And this was a very unjust law. Now, it's important to know that with every form of punishment or discipline inflicted upon an enslaved African, the value of that slave diminished. So if a slave was never beaten, that means that there's no whelps on their bodies. They're never dismembered. They're never branded. They're preserved. They're considered to be strong. They're considered to be obedient, and less problematic. So their values would be really high, which is why you would rarely ever see, well, no, not rarely, but you would see that white women enslavers would not beat their enslaved people as much as white male enslavers. And their values were way higher than white male enslavers. And don't get it twisted. Again, it had nothing to do with white women enslavers feeling like there was a sense of empathy or love for her enslaved person. It was more about preserving their value, more bang for your buck. During this time, white men had the ultimate goal of wanting to be an enslaver because that is where your money was, in owning human property. And if a white woman enslaver married a man who did not have slaves, they would consider their husbands to be lazy because they were not doing much of nothing. So the example the book gave was white women enslavers would be in charge of managing what their slaves ate, did, ran the house, raised the children, and all of this, while their husbands did nothing. But a sidebar. Quick question. How is it that the husband is the only lazy one when you literally have enslaved people doing all the work for you? Just saying. Just saying. Slave-owning women also exercised their rights to establish rules for how you would manage her slaves. For example, restricting punishment through physical discipline was a big one. So if an overseer overstepped, which was common, a white woman enslaver was able to sue the overseer for everything he had, for the diminishing of her property. Not only would she be able to fire him, but she would be able to recuperate her wages by suing him for everything that he had in order to make sure that she was able to maintain her value for the property that was damaged. As I've said, the cruelty that was inflicted upon enslaved Africans was not limited to just white male enslavers. White women enslavers were involved in physical punishment, but they also had limitations as to what they would do. And so when they would allow certain forms of discipline to be inflicted upon their slaves, sometimes they did it, sometimes they allowed someone else to do it. And one of the stipulations that I found to be very interesting is they had an example of an enslaved man being able to be punished, but they would not allow someone else to punish an enslaved woman. I don't understand the psychological choice behind it. But I could imagine just it's their breeder, and their breeder also raised their children, also provided more property, also took care of the home. The author didn't really go into detail as to why that was, but I could make the inference of that's kind of why. And so I'm concluding chapter 3 right there. As you can tell, this chapter was really hard, like chapter 1. I want to know your thoughts. What are your thoughts on the laws that could be passed, that were passed, specifically targeting enslaved Africans and the way that they should be treated? What are your thoughts on white women owning enslaved Africans? Has the 3 chapters that we've gone over enlightened you or changed your mind about what you were told about white women enslavers? Or did you even know white women enslavers existed? What were the roles of white women during the colonial period that you were aware of? What were those roles? Or were you even aware at all? This has been eye-opening for me. And it has been very difficult, to say the least. So I'll be giving y'all a summary of chapter 4 through 8 pretty soon. I just got to get through it and write my summary up and break it down for you. Thank y'all so much for listening.